G'day buddies, I am Jacaro Toro, and on this channel I talk about Australian Aboriginal languages, cultures, history and so on. And speaking of history, this here is Tindale 1974. Norman Tindale was an Australian anthropologist and archeologist. He worked at the South Australian Museum for 49 years. He was born in the year 1900. And this is what we could call his magnum opus. Here on this side we have a folder with maps showing traditional Australian Aboriginal territories as Tindale understood them. And here this is a book, which is sort of a brick in and of itself. Now, when it comes to Australian Aboriginal history and what happened before the British, it is a fact that we in many cases need to resort to sources like Tindale because we don't know really what happened before the British. But we have stories and observations from early travelers traveling in areas where whites were rare or had been non-existent until recently. And actually Norman Tindale is one of those people in the 1920s and 30s. He was out traveling and living periodically with different Australian Aboriginal groups that had recently been contacted. And he writes about lots of things in his brick of a book. So today I thought we could look at what Tindale calls semi-agricultural practices. And I have written the names for a number of plants here that were involved in these semi-agricultural practices. And we will see that the Aborigines were behaving similarly with all of these. So, if we start with the water chestnut, it occurs in swamps in northern Australia. And Tindale wrote that women and children used to dig for corms with digging sticks. And in the process, they would till the soil. And they would also miss a proportion of the crop. And so that would prepare for next year's crop. Not that the Aboriginal women and children necessarily understood that they were preparing for next year's crop that way, but in effect that is what they were doing. Wild rice, similarly, was harvested on the Roper River, which runs here. It goes by the town of Catherine. So wild rice harvested by the Mara and Alawa tribes. And similarly to American Indians, Tindale wrote, the Aborigines would beat the ripened ears with sticks In the process, much grain was lost, and this grain was trampled in the mud, thus preparing for next year's harvest. Yes, we also have a plant like purslane, I believe, is the way to pronounce this name. Purslane, which grows in much of Australia. It is what is called a leaf vegetable, which is used in salads in large parts of the world. So if you've had a salad, chances are that you've eaten purslane. And it produces lots of seeds. Seeds which were traditionally pressed into cakes and then cooked on hot ashes. And the stems of the purslane could be eaten raw by Aborigines or could be heated in ashes, Tindale wrote. Actually, one Edward Palmer may have been the first one in 1884 to draw attention to its use in Australia. He was writing about what was going on the Cloncurry River in this area here, where Mayayabi women used freshwater mussel shells to scoop up the seeds, the purslane seeds. Yes, yam occurs in Australia, in northern Australia, and there are at least 2 species, Tindale writes. And he observed how yam was harvested on islands in the Gulf of Carpentaria here and on Flinders Island. Now, there is more than one Flinders Island in Australia, which is very impractical, but I think he must mean the Flinders Island that is on this side of the Cape York Peninsula. That's the only thing that makes sense. So Tindale saw a magical ritual performed by women on Flinders Island. So they would dig for yam with digging sticks. Then they would scold the stem that guided them to the tuber. They would beat it and then throw it back into the hole. Perhaps urinate on it, and then perhaps throw some dirt over it. They would scold the stem, saying that it was bad, that it had given a bad harvest, telling it to do better next year. So this was a magical ritual for the women there, important for them. What they didn't know or understand was that they were replanting the stem and fertilizing it in the process. So that way making sure that there would be a harvest next year. But according to Tindale, they didn't necessarily understand all of this. Yes. Moving on to nutgrass. This occurs in big parts of Australia, according to Tindale, from north of the Tropic of Capricorn, which is this blue line here, down to the southern coast. And according to Tindale, a ubiquitous activity of Aborigines back in the day when he was out observing. was to turn over large areas of country, searching for tiny combs. And they of course turned over the soil in the process, and they missed some combs, inevitably, thus also preparing for next year's harvest. I will be back with more videos about what Tindale wrote about his observations in the 1920s and 30s. But this will be all for today, so see you later.